So humility, it's a very elusive virtue, and people are kind of hesitant or reluctant or maybe even put off by it, and they're not sure if they really want it or what it really means. Part of it is due, I think, to the counterfeits of humility which you find in people and literature, etc. You know, the one who presents himself as oh so humble, and most of the time it's hypocrisy and show, and too often that's what it can seem like. Oh, I'm striving to be humble. Well, if you are busy striving to be humble, there's too much ego there, which means you're not humble. So there's something wrong with the whole thing of trying to pursue humility. We have to understand what it is first. So yes, we have to put ourselves in perspective. St. Teresa of Jesus gives one of the most famous and enduring definitions of humility. She says, humility is truth. It's in the truth of who we are, without pretense, show, exaggeration. And I think if we look at ourselves truthfully, we can see how, well, basically how insignificant we are in the grand scheme of things. When I did the retreat with my friend Father Richard Rohr many years ago on men's rites of passage, the things we had to meditate on, some of the basic truths were, life is difficult, you're not important, you're going to die, and you're not in control. So enough with all these pretenses and strivings and pretend, you know, it's in perspective. And we know today, you know, each one of us is one of billions of humans on this planet, of past and future and present. So, and we know even more better today, you know, cosmically speaking, astronomically speaking, here on these little tiny planets, it's not the center of the universe with the sun going around us and God up in the heavens, not too far away. No. Well, God's not too far away, but it's not because he's up there just above the stratosphere. We're a tiny planet around a rather insignificant sun and a minor galaxy in a minor solar system in a huge galaxy, one of a smaller galaxy among billions of galaxies. So really now, who do you think you are? So that's the truth. And that's what would help us to, well, for example, not take the place of honor at banquets, because who are we really? But if we go a little further with the truth, and Richard Rohr pointed this out also in comparison to those first truths, is that, you know, we are children of God. You put it this way, you know, life is not about us. We're about life. So we're called as children of God to behave as children of God. That's our truth. Likewise, our truth is that we are children of God. We're called to be transformed in Christ, to live as Christ, to love one another as I have loved you by the power of Christ in us. That is our deep dignity. And that's actually how we can be humble. My favorite new definition of humility is not that we think less of ourselves. After all, we're children of God. Not that we think less of ourselves, but that we think of ourselves less. That's real humility. We're not preoccupied with ourselves and our own image and our own self-aggrandizement and our own advancement and all that stuff which you get on social media ad nauseum. But that we are, well, life is not about us. We're about life. So to live as Christ, that's our truth. To be truly humble, to think of ourselves less. And that makes us like Christ. Who's the most humble person in the history of the world? Jesus Christ. What do you mean? Jesus was God. That's why. That's why he's the humblest person in the world. Never thinking of himself, thinking of himself less. In fact, thinking of himself never, neither during his lifetime nor now, totally at our service. And he does that because, not only because he's reached the fullness of being the Son of God in his humanity, but because he's the Son of God in his divinity. God is humble. God never thinks of God's self, ever. Cannot reflect back on himself and his own glory and his, all that. No. Totally given over, poured out, as Paul says about Christ in his incarnation and crucifixion and resurrection, poured out for the life of the world. You are about life, the same way God and Christ are about life. Pouring themselves out for others, thinking of themselves less and not at all. I bet you never thought that God was humble, or could be humble. There was a book came out when I was a monk in France called L'Humilité de Dieu, the humility of God. And some of my fellow monks were, what? God can't be humble. We're humble. I mean, God is, glorious and majestic. Well, God's glory and majesty are his humility. The fact that God is total love, as John the Evangelist says, God is love, pouring God's self out constantly and totally, without a single thought back on himself. And that's what we're called to. That's what we're called to be. That's the truth. Humility is truth of who we are. And that's thinking of ourselves less. Not at all, in fact. By pouring ourselves out constantly by the grace and love of Christ in us to be imitators of Christ, imitation of Christ, and imitators of God, who is the summit of humility. And that's the second part of the parable, isn't it, in the gospel today? When you give a banquet, don't think about, I'm going to invite so-and-so because he's rich and important and socially prominent and he can do stuff for me and he'll invite me back and blah, blah, blah. No. Pour out yourself without a thought back on yourself for those who are most in need, who can't pay you, who are just who they are. You be just who you are by serving Christ. By serving Christ as Christ who's serving in you, serving Christ. Christ serving Christ, as I've said many times. And that's what Jesus says, what you did to the least of these, the poor, the blind, the lame in the parable, or the sick and the immigrant, the stranger, the sick, the prisoner, the hungry and the thirsty, you did to me, for me. So, if you want to ask, how can I be humble? Just ask, how can I be godlike? And what's the greatest example of humility? God. So let that be the way we approach humility. Not thinking less of ourselves, after all, we're Christ. But precisely living as Christ, thinking of ourselves less. Life is not about us. We are about life the same way Jesus, who is our life, poured out his life so that we might have life and share his life. That's what humility really is. That's a pretty lofty ideal, right? To be godlike. It's worth striving for, or worth letting God's grace work through us.